I think. Oh, sure. In a in a better world, I would be introducing the fifth iteration of the Dr. Saul and Dorothy Kitt Film Noir Festival now, instead of the third. And also in a better world, I think the themes that we'll be exploring over the next week or so, under the rubric of film noir and the Jewish experience, would be less timely and than they have become over the last 2 year hiatus. I want to start out by dedicating this year's festival to Professor Thomas Elsasser, who taught at Columbia and who was a speaker at the very first Kit Noir Film Festival back in 2018. A little anecdote here. Those of you who did attend that festival might remember that we had a keynote speaker that couldn't happen because there was a snowstorm. And Professor Elsasser was scheduled to give a talk at the very final day of the festival, bereft of our keynote, which was meant to kind of set everything up. Thomas decided, without any prompting from anyone, that he would provide that overview of film noir and the kind of big lecture to get things rolling. It's rare to find a scholar who's at the absolute top of their field who has time enough to be that generous, and I think it speaks to Professor Elsasser's qualities as a person as well as his qualities as a scholar. But now let me pass things over to Dean Carol Becker for some introductory remarks. Thanks.
Hi, everybody. This is the introduction of the introduction of the introduction. Welcome. I'm Carol Becker, Dean of Columbia University School of the Arts, and welcome to the 2022 edition of the Dr. Saul and Dorothy Kitt Film Noir Festival. And this year it's entitled Film Noir and the Jewish Experience from World War II to the Blackout. So we've waited 2 years, as Rob said, to have this in-person festival at the Lentfest Center for the Arts, and we're really thrilled to be back. We are thrilled to be back. The students are thrilled to be back. It's a good moment. This festival was originally planned for late March 2020. It was exactly the time of the lockdowns that were first mandated in New York City. So we're absolutely delighted that we can actually be here together and that we're happening live and also live streamed. So it's an important moment for New York City, for Columbia University School of the Arts, and for all of us assembled tonight for really a much needed collective experience such as the annual Kit Noir Festival. The last 2 years of planning, unplanning, replanning, unplanning, replanning were not simple for anyone in this room, I know. And I want to acknowledge the patience and generosity of the festival sponsor, Gordon Kitt. And that of the Noir team, led by Soheil Reza Yazdi, as well as Roberta Albert, who's here tonight, Associate Dean for Development, the School of the Arts. I want to thank also the Lenfest staff, who are, I can't even tell you how fabulous they are. Lauren Wagle, Brendan Regenball, Natasha Norton, Robin Margulis. And this is a really dedicated group of people who really found incredibly creative ways to adapt to very unprecedented circumstances. And I want to thank Rob King, who is the director of the MA program of Film and Media Studies, but I want to thank him for his patience and also for his imaginative approach to these festivals. He was willing to pivot so many times. And last year, we were able to offer a truly fabulous virtual festival of the Kit Noir Festival on the theme of the US-Mexican border. And it required an entirely different approach to what we think of as a film festival and was remarkably successful. So as you all know, when it comes to such movies and these gorgeous prints that you're going to see in the next days, there really is no substitute for the big screen, nor for the presence of an audience with whom to view them collectively. So please spread the word that we're back and we're live, and we're going to look forward to seeing everyone for the next 4 days and nights. And now I get to introduce the founder and really generous donor of the Dr. Saul and Dorothy Kitt Film Noir Festival, Gordon Kitt.
Thank you, Dean Becker. The first year of the Kit Noir Film Festival was foundational, focusing on the Hollywood films shown in Paris just after World War II. The French film critics were the first ones to refer to this uniquely American genre as film noir, owing to its dark themes and moody cinematography. The second year of the Kit Noir Film Festival focused on the most prolific author of noir radio, television, and film, Cornell Woolrich, a 1920s Columbia University student dropout. During the pandemic, we ran a free virtual mini festival presenting films set at the US Mexico border, which has been both a third rail in American politics and a setting for crime fiction. This year, in film noir and the Jewish experience, World War II to the blacklist, we return to the foundational roots of Hollywood film noir, Jewish immigrants and refugees, who played a pivotal role in the creation of classic Hollywood film noir. During the festival, we will explore what was it about their culture, perspective, and historical circumstances that made their contribution to classic Hollywood film noir formative. My grandparents were Jewish immigrants from America, escaping the pogroms of Eastern Europe over 100 years ago, arriving shortly after the birth of Cornell Woolrich. My paternal grandfather was a union organizer and emigrated from the western region of Imperial Russia. His original surname was Katai, which is the modern Russian word for China, and may derive from the old Russian word for braids. So as you know, in China, the men used to wear queues or braids. For some long lost reason, our surname was shortened to Kit after my grandfather emigrated to the US. My paternal grandmother's Belarusian internal passport referred to her as an illiterate virgin, partly because she spoke Yiddish, not Russian, and because she was unmarried, she was assumed to be a virgin. When I was growing up, only my maternal grandparents were still alive. They emigrated to the US from a town north of Kyiv. My maternal grandfather was a tailor, and we often asked my maternal grandparents about the old country. And they refused to talk about it. For them, it was the past, and they wanted to look forward to the future. The Judaic emphasis of life as it is here and now. My parents, first generation Americans, didn't know much about their parents' past, and they weren't curious, and they never really asked. They too looked forward. In contrast, at the Kit Noir Film Festival, we look to the past. One of the reasons why I endowed this film festival is because I believe it is important to know and understand the past, as only with such an understanding can one understand the present and glimpse the future. Film noir, and film particularly, is uniquely able to capture the past, an era, a place, a mood, a culture. But the study of film history can be tricky and controversial, as the analysis of a film genre is inevitably a reflection of the generation conducting the analysis, and thus changes over time. Film noir not only reflects the history and culture of the period in which it was initially produced, the 1940s and 1950s, film noir helped mold and influence the culture of its time and continues to do so today. That is why we are here tonight. I want to thank Professor Ann Douglas and Rob King and everyone at Columbia who has helped to make the festival a reality. And especially thank you all for coming. Thank you.
It now falls to me to introduce our speaker for today. It's really been one of the great privileges of my academic career, and in particular my time at Columbia, to have gotten to know Ann Douglas, who I knew previously as someone with pride of place on my bookshelf, but now I know as a great friend and a fantastic scholar. She's, of course, an almost legendary figure, having blazed a trail through Harvard, Princeton, and now at Columbia, and deserves no or kind of no introduction would be equal to her accomplishments. So I'll simply pass it over to you. Thank you, Anne.
You can see why I love this. These two men here who have really changed my life at Columbia. Because I've been teaching film noir here since 1994, which is a very long time. And at Columbia, since the film school is very separate actually from the regular, the rest of the undergraduate body, I didn't really, I didn't have access to the films or the equipment of the film department. Anyway, it's been a wonderful experience for me, just a great blessing in my life that Gordon has made this gift to the university and that Gordon and I have been able to share so much. Gordon is the best informed amateur. Don't get me wrong. I simply mean he's not a professor of film, but he knows so much about film noir, which is a great pleasure. And I won't go on about Rob. So I'm going to start tonight with a simple aphorism. I gradually, over those years of teaching film noir, I realized at a certain point, I'm not sure when, maybe after 3 or 4 years, that so many of the directors and writers that I was teaching and the films themselves came out of Jewish writers, directors, and sometimes art directors. In Hollywood, many of them emigres, of course, from Europe fleeing Hitler. And been falsely conceived as a canonical project, by which I simply mean many film noir scholars now include films like Rebecca, which came out in 1940, or The Letter, which also came with Betty Davis, the star of the movie. In any case, if women had been scholars of film noir when the canon was being formed back in the late 60s and 70s, you would have probably staked out a very different trajectory. You would have said, oh, female melodrama is really the center of noir. It still involves murder, it still may take place in a big city, but it's very different. So we've had another change that's been occurring over the last 10, 15, 20 years, I would say, which is that more attention is being belatedly paid to women's film noir, but also for my purposes tonight, the date of film noir's point of origin has been set back. It used to be, well, it was the early 1940s. Its peak, we all know, in terms of numbers, was the second half of the 40s and the beginning of the 50s. But increasingly, and we will be having a speaker, Vincent Brooks, who wrote a wonderful book called Driven into Darkness, who will be addressing us by Zoom, and he has written a wonderful book about this. But anyway, as I was kind of ruminating about what I was teaching, I realized that I too more and more want to go back into the late 1930s as the starting point. There are 2 films by John Brahm, a German emigre director who came to Hollywood called Rio and Let Us Live, two separate films, one with Henry Fonda, that are, I think, indisputably noirs. Now, for what it's worth, I believe that noir is a distinct phenomenon. I'm one of the people who thinks that noir is actually a genre. There's a lot of controversy. Is it a style? Is it a collection of motifs and cinematographic techniques? But no, I think it is actually a genre, and I think you can make that case by looking at the cast, the directors, the timing. So I do make a real distinction between the gangster crime films of the 30s and these films that begin in the late 1930s. And I gradually came up with a little syllogism that is much too simple, but it still conveys something essential about film noir, and which is the topic of this festival. And that is no Hitler, no World War II. No Hitler, no Holocaust. No Hitler, no noir. And that explains, for me, part of the reason why it does make sense to go back to the late 1930s. When you look at, I am not trying to say that noir is a Jewish genre by itself. It's very interesting. Noir is a pretty unbroken tradition. It moved into television in the 50s and 60s, fewer noirs in theaters, but it never went away. Actually, at this point, you could probably argue that it is the longest lived of the Hollywood genres. The Western, yes, we get revivals. Musicals, yes, we get revivals. Melodramas are always going to be with us. But noir, starting in the late 30s and on and off right to the present day, has persisted. Its longevity, even as it shifts shape, is remarkable and extraordinary. So when as I say, I am not trying to argue that this is a Jewish form. Neo-noir, which is a proof of noir's longevity, which is usually dated back to maybe the late 60s, the early 70s, Martin Scorsese, Francis Ford Coppola. These are not Jews. You could even argue that neo-noir seems to be predominantly a group of young Italian American directors. So it's not, and I believe that that is because they stayed in the cities. Again, noir is not exclusively an urban phenomenon. There are rural stories that are very much film noirs, but nonetheless. So my point is that this is, that Jews have a unusual and strong signature in film noir. Again, no one would deny the greatness, the importance to this tradition and the variations created by John Huston, Alfred Hitchcock, Nicholas Ray. But I would argue that there are different signs, that there are different motifs that are more insistent in this Jewish tradition of noir, and I will be talking about them. Some of them are an emphasis on the pariah. I'm going to show a clip in a little while from Stranger on the Third Floor, directed by a Russian-American emigre, Boris Ingster, with Peter Lorre, the great, the indispensable, the one and only Peter Lorre. Another motif, which I call really after the legal name for it, hue and cry. Hue and cry goes back to common law. Gordon maybe could fill me in on 100 years ago. A law evolved in which if you saw a crime being committed, you had an obligation to try to stop it if you could, to get help if you could, to inform people if you could. You literally raised a hue and cry. And in the noirs that I'm talking about tonight, this is a repeated motif, and it fails. We will start out, maybe I should do that now. This is actually number 1, I think, on my list. It's Address Unknown. It is number 1, and it is directed by Cameron Menzies, and it's from 1944. Are we okay with that? And let me just set the scene for you. 2 good friends in Hitler's Germany, one a Jew, one a Gentile, one played by Morris Karnofsky, have been very close friends. Their daughter and son, the daughter is Jewish, the son belongs to the Gentile friend. They have fallen in love. They plan to get married. She wants, however, to have a career. It's set in the time, it's set in the early 40s. She wants to have a career. She adopts a Gentile name. She wants to be a singer. And things go well, and gradually she is spotted as a Jew, and she has to flee. She goes to her father's friend, who is a Gentile, to whose son she's engaged, begging to be taken in and sheltered, as in fact a number of Jews, of course, were taken in and sheltered and passed off as Gentile during the years of the Third Reich. So she's coming to this house that she knows so well, that she's been to often as a child. Are we set with Address Unknown? So that is one pattern, which I'm saying is particularly pronounced in the group of films that we'll be looking at. Hue and cry. She is both been made a pariah, and she's about to be shot, obviously, by a Nazi posse. And instead of taking her into the house, he pushes her out. Some of this, when I was going over this presentation last night and today, thinking it sounds so grim, and a good deal of it is grim. And yet we're also talking about the creation of a new variation on an old cinematic form, and the excitement of the artists involved, the actors, many of whom, of course, are Gentile, the actors, the producers, the directors, the scriptwriters, the cinematographers. This is also a moment of peak creativity, and that should never be forgotten. I'm not going to use all my examples now, but let me give you some of the other themes or devices which you find here. Hitler figures abound. And when I say Hitler figures, at one point, in fact, I was asked, well, why do I think, for example, in Gilda, a very famous film with Rita Hayworth as the beautiful femme fatale, who's in Argentina, working in a club and gets married to a brutally cold and possessive and homicidal man, played by George McCready. And he he will not respond to her in any overt way. He simply wants to control her. And I think I would like to play this scene if I could. This is Gilda is number 5. They're in their bedroom, and let me say just one word. They're married. She marries him, big mistake. She then takes, it turns out she already knew the man who was working now as Balin, that's his name, his assistant. They have a clearly homoerotic relationship, so it's very complicated. It's a triangle that is equally vivid in the relation of the three parts. And she marries him to make Glenn Ford, the former lover that she's still in love with, to make him jealous. Very bad move. And they are in the bedroom together. And the interesting thing about this bedroom is that there is a safe in it with all of Balin's money. He has a lot of it. So the safe is in the bedroom, a kind of noir, typical confusion between the money and the sex, the love and the sex, if there is any. But he is exemplary of this kind of figure I'm discussing. Do any of you know a movie called Brute Force with Burt Lancaster? I know some of you do. Well, if you don't, you might want to find out about it. It was produced by Mark Hellinger, directed by Jules Dassin. Mark Hellinger was a very important figure in film noir. He was a Broadway columnist, crime court reporter who knew and believed he could be a playwright and a writer of films, came to Hollywood, worked at Warner Brothers. He probably was one of the 2 or 3 people who understood who Humphrey Bogart could be. That's important. That, to me, is one of the markers of the time that something shifted. Bogey was always going to be a secondary player in gangster films. He is usually the one against whom James Cagney is pitted as the better, the more vigorous, the more honest. He's your run-of-the-mill gangster type, kind of speaking out of the side of his mouth. If you watch quite a few of Humphrey Bogart's movies from the 30s, he really is not yet Bogart. And he once said to a woman, that actor that he was working with, he was explaining to her how to play a scene. It was Mary Astor. And he said to her, "Don't go to the camera. Let the camera find you." That's not really how most 1930s films work, but it is how noir works. So Bogart, who has been on Broadway and then in Hollywood for 20 years, 19 years to be precise, and has never risen above a supporting lead player, with one exception, a play that he had done on Broadway and then made into a movie. Jack Warner did not want to cast him. So he became a star with Maltese Falcon. My own preference is, in fact, High Sierra, a truly great film with Ida Lupino. So what was it about Bogart that made him a star, maybe the biggest male star in Hollywood noir cinema, when he'd been kicking around there and had not been able to find a place for himself? It's hard to believe, but Bogart was second in command always to George Raft. A good part got offered to George Raft. If he didn't want to take it, then maybe Humphrey Bogart would get it. And this changed. And it is exactly this. He lets the camera come to him. But this was just to say that Mark Hellinger recognized Bogart before Jack Warner did. And he, in fact, was a co-producer on High Sierra. Now, I'm going backwards now, back to Gilda, who is the most ambiguous femme fatale, perhaps. Is she or isn't she? I think she's not, in Gilda. And here she is in the bedroom with the safe in the bedroom, the money that, in fact, this guy, just to make the obvious connection with the topic of our film festival this year, he is a Nazi. He's not officially identified as a Nazi, but the people he works with are Germans who are not happy when Germany loses the war. This kind of coding in which someone stands in for a Nazi. In this case, it's set in Argentina, where 60,000 former Nazis eventually migrated after Germany's defeat. And it's set in Buenos Aires. So here they are in the bedroom, and you just get a sense of Wahlen, who actually here could be reciting one of Hitler's most famous lines. Hitler, by the way, did not have famous lines. That's what makes him very different, even from Stalin. There's lots of difference between Hitler and Stalin. But I simply mean Stalin did not conduct a Holocaust. And also he was a much better commander. But what makes him different, among other things, is that Hitler never said anything memorable. I doubt anyone in this audience can come up with, remember when Hitler said, some equivalent of we'll be fighting on the beaches, or some aperçu French style of wisdom and wit about statecraft, or something that you think, that's what they got excited about. Something that was smart? No, it didn't happen. Okay, so let's go to Gilda. The way Hitler put it was hate and be hard. That is all that is important. So again, these pretty clear Hitler, Nazi associated figures. And then another very important theme, in this case, a character or a group of characters, is the figure of the extra, the minor character, the walk-on character. Noir is always interested in what some critics call the periphery of noir. In the center are the stars conducting their crimes, their love affairs, their passions, giving their speeches, deceiving one another, collaborating with one another. But noir takes time to follow the people who don't have anything to do with this plot. They are the servants. One of the most common figures in noir, in these extras, is the cleaning woman who is mopping the floor, and other characters are going back and forth. Or at the start of a movie called A Double Life, which stars Ronald Colman and is about an actor who is beginning to lose confidence in his marriage and in his art and murders someone. We don't know that yet. We're outside, we're in Broadway, and we go inside the theater to see posters of this actor proving to us how famous he really is and what a star he is and what pressure he is under. And we see someone working at the theater, the Empire Theater it's called, who just walks up the stairs. He's tending to the banister. There's no reason for him to be there. or at the end of Mildred Pierce with Joan Crawford. She leaves reunited after a tumultuous affair with someone her daughter fell in love with and murdered, and is now going to go to jail for the rest of her life because of it. Joan Crawford, who's been the noble mother, has had to deal with the fact that she has clearly spoiled this young woman. In any case, as she's walking out, there is a woman, she's walking out of a police station, who is scrubbing the front of the police. And these happen again and again. And it's a reminder that there are other people other than the stars, that there are smaller people, that there are people whose lives are governed by these unstable creatures we're witnessing at the center of the drama. And the film that we are not seeing at the festival, but again, I recommend to all of you, is a film called The Stranger on the Third Floor, which was traditionally, until this new move to push noir's origins back a year or two, took hold, was for a long time considered the first real noir in 1940. And the story is simply about a young man and a young woman who get involved with a murder of which eventually he himself is accused. And there's a kind of mysterious, strange, mad person, young man, played by Peter Lorre. Peter Lorre is one of the central actors of the noir tradition. In a way, he had his greatest part first, which can be a tragedy for an actor. He was the star of Fritz Lang's M, a film made in Germany, one of the early talkies there, in 1931, with Peter Lorre. He is, in that movie, he is playing a pervert who sexually molests girls, young girls. Mothers are all terrified of him. The police don't seem to be able to do anything about him. And the underworld, thieves and pimps and criminals of various stripes, whom we come to be quite fond of, I think, in the course of M, they hold a trial for him. And once he's identified, one of the street people writes on the side of his shoulder in chalk an M for murderer. Same in German name, begins with an M. And this was a major film, one of the great films, and very hard. This is 1931. I'm not going to call it noir, but I am going to say it is hard to imagine noir taking the same direction without this early work by Fritz Lang. But Peter Lorre never really escaped that part. And although he was able to play Raskolnikov finally in the US with Joseph von Sternberg in Crime and Punishment, he really didn't get the kinds of extended, detailed parts that a great actor needs. But in this movie, Stranger on the Third Floor, it turns out he is the killer. He's also somehow helpless and moving, and I mean, he's essentially someone who should be unimportant, who turns out to be at the center of everything. And he has passings with the young woman and the young man in the story. And I'm just showing you a very brief clip, but it is wonderfully done. And this, as I say, was actually directed by a Russian who had problems of his own to flee. And he's going down the stairs, as you will see. So this is number 4, Stranger on the 3rd floor. One of the most perfect things, I think, in that clip, the cinematographer is Nicholas Musaraka, who with John Alton and James Wong Howe, I think are the great trinity of cinematographers in noir. All of them worked in other genres as well, but they helped set the style. Perhaps John Alton, who was himself a European emigre Jew, probably is the best known. But Musaraka, who can do anything, that's one of the wonderful things about Hollywood and European directors who came here. That was the great surprise, how good the cinematographers were. Many of them were European. Fritz Lang found himself working with the cinematographer he'd worked with already in Germany. In fact, a few of the emigres complained that the cinematographers were so good and so used to getting their way because, as they pointed out, the directors they usually worked with, Americans no doubt, really didn't understand the camera or what was necessary, so they kind of handed over. This is certainly true of John Ford, considered one of the great, not a noir director, but one of our great directors. His cinematographers, and he worked with a couple of them many times over, they knew exactly what he would want. He didn't have to instruct them. One of them said he never looked through the viewfinder, just meaning he didn't do the elementary work of visualizing it. They knew exactly what he wanted. So it meant that the cinematographer was irreplaceable. James Wong Howe liked to point that out. You could replace a director, you could replace an actor, but the camera is what separates a movie from a play, a movie from anything written, but most of all from theater. And it took craft, and it took skill, and it took new inventions, which noir benefited from. So here we see Musaraka, Nicholas Musaraka, an Italian-American, and that wonderful moment when Peter Lorre comes out of the door and starts to throw his scarf around his neck, and Musaraka, or the director, Inkster, but it's Musaraka's the director of photography, finishes the gesture not by our seeing the rest of the movement that Peter Lorre makes, but rather by showing shadow on the wall. So he translates the gesture and the body to a shadow, to a reflection, a dark reflection of itself. And I think you can also see, even in that very short time, just how expressive Peter Lorre is, just how much he can do. His face, he is undergoing 20 different emotions while creating a single mood. He fractures and complicates what you feel as an overpowering sense, which is he might be dangerous, he's definitely hunted, he's definitely on the run. Now, speaking of the hunted, I'm using my last example, and then I'm going to go back and make a few more points about the origins of noir. My last example is the hunted, and this is the pattern I'm talking about. And we've already seen that several times. These patterns, peripheral characters reminding you both that the work of the world is supporting these people who are wasting its resources and often hating and loving and tangling up endlessly totally self-involved with each other. But many of them, the pariahs, of course, are not born, they are made. The hue and cry, the need for a rescue, the need for safety that isn't granted, that isn't given. One more, I'm gonna go backwards now to euthanasia, which is a theme that doesn't come up often in noirs of the early 40s, but comes up several times very powerfully. Gordon once asked me, after he'd been seeing, he seems to be seeing almost every film made around this time, but film noir, aren't there an awful lot of crippled people in film noir? And this is something that's interested me, partly because it's easily explained in one sense. They had a disabled president. And although it was not openly discussed, FDR very seldom mentioned this. In his last appearance before Congress, not long before he died, he was reporting on the Yalta Peace Conference, which took place with Stalin and now Attlee. Churchill had been voted out. And he was giving a report to Congress that was not, as so often with FDR, was not strictly candid. He wasn't discussing what was going to happen to Eastern Europe, but he actually came before Congress in a wheelchair and said, "It is easier for me." And the other occasions when we know he made it, aside from, of course, his inner circle, diplomats as well, but he went several times to hospitals of veterans because he, and to those who had been severely wounded, crippled, hurt for life, because he wanted them to understand that they had a president who spent his life in a wheelchair. So there's a plethora of cripples. I have now seen, usually it's estimated that there are about 700 noirs made between 1939, and people push the end date as well as the beginning date. They push that back, and the end date, or the period of its big popularity as that fades out. I myself push it into the 60s, because otherwise what am I going to do with Sam Fuller, one of the great, again, another Jewish director and writer and novelist. Pick Up on South Street is probably his most famous movie. We couldn't, of course, get all of these films in, but looking at these films, as I say, I've now seen 535 to be exact. I keep a list. I'm at 535, and I hope to go to at least 625 in the next few years. But actually, it does get harder to access some of these films. But so, of a sample of about 535, there are almost 50 noirs with cripples. That I have done comparisons. That obviously does not hold across all other genres. Westerns really aren't going to spend a lot of time with cripples, neither are musicals. There are certainly dramas of people who are sick or in wheelchairs, but in no other genre have I found the incidence of cripples. And I think that this has a good deal to do with FDR. It has a good deal to do with the origins of noir in the end of the 30s, of a Depression decade that the United States really, as we know, only came out of, not through the New Deal programs, but rather through wartime production, first by Lend-Lease to Great Britain, and then when Hitler The Wehrmacht attacked Russia on June 22nd, then the Soviet Union, 1941, and then Lend-Lease aid to Russia. And then, of course, shortly after Russia, the US entered the war itself. So that was what brought prosperity. This is the only time which I think relates to the plethora of crippled people that I'm discussing. And by the way, some cripples are good. It's not a simple picture. There are evil cripples as well. There's a film called All That Heaven Allows, which is one of the great color noirs. It's from 1945. It stars Jean Tierney, who, with Rita Hayworth, for my money, is the most beautiful woman, perhaps ever in Hollywood films. And she falls in love with a young writer who's completely devoted to his young crippled brother, Danny. The writer whom she's in love with and married to eventually is played by Cornell Wilde. And this brother, he has had polio, presumably. He's crippled for life, and that's who he is. Jean Tierney hates him because he takes some of the attention of her husband from him for himself, and she drowns him. She's been taking him out every day in the lake so that he can swim, which is good for him, and he's going to show his brother how he's developed these skills. And she deliberately, as he struggles, he's hit some sort of cramp, or she pulls her rowboat away. Then she sees her husband approaching, and she starts rowing. But she is obviously evil, and this cripple is a lovely, sometimes the good characters in film noirs are not the ones you're most interested in. So he's not interesting, but he is a sweet little brother, and she is malevolent and absolutely gorgeous as she goes about murdering him and then trying to cover it up. So there's a very good cripple. But there's another wonderful film noir called The Sign of the Ram, which came out in 1944, I believe. And that stars a young actress called Susan Peters. And she has been crippled. And this has obviously interfered with her love life. And she, the cripple, is the one who is trying to murder people. So this isn't all cripples are all good people. It is just that the deformed or disabled body was of central interest to this culture in a way that has never been true really since. We have all kinds of concerns for how you treat people who are disabled, including oneself. But that's not quite the same thing as doing 50 movies out of 700 featuring important crippled characters. So this, the last example I'm going to is an example again of The Hunted. And I'm going to say not too much about this because, like one or two other films that I've mentioned, you will be hearing more about it. It is being viewed at the festival and introduced by absolutely wonderful, a wonderful film scholar. But this is a film called He Ran All the Way. And it stars John Garfield. This is a Blacklist production, virtually everyone working on it except James Wong Howe, the cinematographer, was blacklisted and was, in fact, in the case of its star, John Garfield, who was he was born in this country, New York Jew, born as Jules Garfinkel. The studio, of course, changed his name to John Garfield, but he always insisted on being called Julie. That was who he was. He always was Julie. He was, in many ways, Marlon Brando's most important predecessor. He was a product. Of a more 30s style, a more socially self-conscious. But there was also the moody, introspective. And he was a major, major talent. He was called before HUAC. He would not name names. He tried to get out of it. He wrote an article, "I was a sucker for a left hook." But he'd already had a heart condition, and the pressure of this ongoing HUAC investigation, he had a fatal heart attack and he died not that long, in fact, after this movie. So he ran all the way. Jules Dassin is the director, and it is about a young man who has not found his way, who is drifting into crime without exactly meaning to. He will, in fact, commit a major crime without meaning to. But he has the most awful mother. And this is really saying something, I think, in Hollywood cinema of the post-war decade. And the movie opens, he is having a nightmare. He's in bed, and he wakes up in this room with his mother. And he's being hunted at the very start of the film by his own demons. His mother takes over the job once he wakes up. Okay, so I'm ready now for number 6. Yes, I know you see what I meant. Now, just to go back in the time that I have left, one of the real questions about film noir is, why did the Hollywood moguls, as they're called — I've come to dislike that term, mogul, simply because the Hollywood heads of studios, the founders in most cases, in all cases, of the studios were not from India or Mongolia. They were actually Europeans who came to this country. So I have been kind of searching for my own word, and I've come up, it's not quite right, but I've come up with the Hollywood Titans, because I figured that's just Greek mythology. Europeans all know about Greek mythology, so that's what I call them. But of course, the Hollywood Titans, the heads of studios like the Warner Brothers and Louis B. Mayer, who was really replaced at MGM, which he had done a great deal to make. He was replaced by Dori Shari, another very important producer, like Mark Hellinger of film noir, who was taking the studio in a completely different direction. What often strikes you if you're looking at MGM films of the 30s, and nothing holds true across the board, but MGM films are very brightly lit. Really, many of them are flood lighting, quite the opposite of how we think of film noir. And so Dory Shari, who brought in John Alton and the director that he worked most with, another great director of Westerns as well as noirs, Anthony Mann, a very different kind of pair than Louis B. Mayer would have hired. So there's a shift, and it's interesting to see it happening at MGM, the most noir resistant, and the studio that actually has the fewest noirs. Thanks to Dory Shari, it has dozens of noirs, but the top noir studio was United Artists, which is always a special case, since they are producing, distributing, they aren't making the film. Someone else is working with them. So if you go to the other studios, the top is RKO, then comes Columbia, Warner Brothers. So MGM is not high on the list, but it really wouldn't be there at all. And as Neil Gobler showed us decades ago now in An Empire of Their Own, these Hollywood titans who founded the studios, Harry Cohn, my favorite of the studio heads, he's the one who said when he was asked how it felt to be head of a studio that had risen from Poverty Row. Columbia is the only studio that rose from Poverty Row to join the majors. Anyway, he was asked how he liked running a studio, hiring people, chasing women all over the lot, I should tell you. And he said it beats being a pimp. That's one reason that I love him, and I just have to tell you that one or two of the women whose lives he made miserable while he was bossing them around at Columbia, at least one of them, Evelyn Keyes, said later how much she missed him because she knew that as much trouble as he gave her, he would always protect her. He would always see that if she was on a loan out, she was going to get the best deal. He cared. Joseph Losey, who was blacklisted in the early 50s and ended up being a very famous British director whom the Brits think of very much as their own. But actually, for my money, the best film he ever did was The Prowler in the early 1950s with Van Heflin. Anyway, and he also did a film called film noir called The Big Night. So he, his experience, the Hollywood titans did indeed collaborate with, they were afraid not to, with the blacklist. They strictly obeyed whatever was given to them. And there was Joseph Losey, who became probably a much bigger fish in the smaller pond of British fiction features than he could have been here. But he said in one interview that he really missed the Hollywood titans, because he said, you could laugh at them. Some of them didn't speak good English, and the writers, the clever writers, loved making fun of how Harry Cohn talked, or Louis B. Mayer talked, or William Fox talked. He said, but they really cared about pictures. And I think, why did they, who had come up from immigrant, sometimes quite impoverished circumstances, certainly working class. Harry Cohn actually is sort of an exception there. But why did they allow unhappy endings? I want to just say something about the unhappy endings and to remind you again that noir, that is one of its distinguishing features. It is not because noir always has an unhappy ending, In my own study group, so to speak, I've found about half of noirs have an unhappy ending, meaning the couple splits apart, someone dies, justice is not fully rendered because it can't be, the situation has gone too far for that. That's a staggering percentage. I checked it against Westerns and musicals. Musicals are almost certain to be reasonably rousing, at least in their closing moments. But sometimes students are surprised that there are so many noirs with happy endings. In Gilda, I am deliberately sticking to films that you aren't going to see, so I'm not I'm not giving away the ending here. But in Gilda, this is Gilda with Rita Hayworth, and you saw her with Balin. Hate is a very exciting emotion. There she is. Finally, I won't explain the complexities, but Balin is shot, as indeed he should be, and it turns out it wasn't a crime to shoot him. And Johnny Farrell, played by Glenn Ford, and Rita Hayworth, who is, of course, Gilda, they end up on a boat going back to America. It's a happy ending. But interestingly enough, Gilda was directed, I should say, by Charles Vidor, another emigre Jewish director who came to Hollywood before Hitler. So it's ending with they're happy, they're on the boat. But if you're used to Hollywood endings of this period, there's one little detail. They do not kiss. We've seen them kiss before. They had a kiss before, but this is the happy ending. They should be kissing. They should be embracing. They're not. They're standing kind of at the deck. Why is that left out? Well, that little nagging detail of where's the kiss is very typical of these happy endings that don't quite work because they don't fit the rest of the film that we've just seen. We have just seen that Johnny is certainly capable of malice, cruelty, crudity, homosexuality, if that might bother his prospective wife. We have seen them sparring elegantly, ferociously, sometimes with genuine repartee, but mainly they're just trying to knock the other one out. We have seen nothing to suggest that Rita Hayworth, who I can just tell you from my students, they adore her. They hate Glenn Ford. They hate Johnny. They don't understand what she's doing with him. I've had students write papers about this is so wrong. I just can't bear it. She shouldn't be with him. She's so beautiful and this and that. But more importantly, it's just the point that what have we been doing for the previous hour and a half if these people are going to get together? So I would say I would refine that statistic, if it is one, that about half of all noirs have happy endings, half unhappy, to say that the happy endings a good deal of the time, in about half those cases, are not fully believable. There are two big exceptions to this. A movie that has Lucille Ball in it gets a real happy ending that you actually believe in. And Betty Grable in I Wake Up Screaming. Those two women make the films, make the happy endings plausible by the sheer force of their vitality, goodwill, all the things that made them two of the most popular actors in the United States. Now, do I have about 5 minutes or so, Rob? See, I can't see a clock from here. I have my watch, but it's a little, about 2 minutes, okay. I just wanted to say something about FDR as a part of the framework of noir. FDR, again, he loved mystery novels. He sometimes read one a day, especially when he was away at foreign conferences. He would write home and said, I've read 7 murder mysteries, since here at Yalta or wherever he might happen to be. He liked British fiction. He liked detectives. He liked, he wasn't reading Dashiell Hammett or Raymond Chandler. He did see some noir movies. It's still not absolutely clear who did his programming, and FDR was the person who had a movie theater put into the White House. But it's not clear. He was consulted, but did he ask for things? No one seems really to have determined that. But he did see, he did see a movie called The Unsuspected, in which the husband of a shrewish wife murders her. And he saw that on the very day that the night before Eleanor Roosevelt was due to return to the White House. But he had an enormous impact on the film noir community, because it was largely, the blacklist was the blacklist and a travesty of justice in this country. Nonetheless, the people on the blacklist were pretty much all liberals. Some of them were fellow travelers or had been in the Communist Party, things that I don't feel that obviously we would think was somehow dangerous or risky today. So there was a love for FDR. I never want to give the wrong impression about FDR, whom, as you can tell, I love. My first public memory is, and I was only 2 years old, but somehow everything was in commotion because it was the day FDR died. And it was turmoil, and I'd never seen that. Adults who weren't responding to each other, but to news. And my father had not yet come home from World War II. And so I just wanted to read you one comment by a Hollywood, I can read you, of course, I can read you Joseph Losey's comment, who said, the day FDR died was the blackest day of my life. The day FDR died was the blackest event in my life. An event, not an outside, in my life. And he said, now we know that the New Deal was over, and only now did we see how utterly meaningless the American dream actually was. Can we show, just before I go, do you have the Look magazine? The Look magazine clip from 1945 of this is, if not, well, I'll just tell you about it. It's a photograph taken by the young Stanley Kubrick. He's 17 years old. He's a high school student in the Bronx, and he has a brilliant idea for a photograph. Do we have it? Oh, okay. There it is. Okay, that's not really where I'd like to end it, just because film noir was, in fact, exciting. And it gave opportunities it revived women stars' careers. Joan Crawford, Barbara Stanwyck, they were pushing 40 when Noir came in. Noir gave them another 10 years of their career. Noir was good for the people who made it, for the cinematographers who had more chances for visual adventure than perhaps in almost any other genre. So I don't want to leave you simply with this sense of, it's all down. Film noir is exhilarating. Okay, I guess that is it, and thank you very much. Do we have time for a few questions, if there are any? Yes or no? Yes or no?
Yeah, we got about 2 or 3 minutes that we can do questions.
Is there anyone who would like to please ask a question? Any question?
Sure, James.
Who's the actress that you say Harry Cohn was chasing but who eventually got to miss him?
Well, I'm sorry, I didn't hear. Oh.
You mentioned there was an actress who Harry Cohn was chasing around.
Oh, Evelyn Keyes.
Oh,
yeah. A terrific actress, 99 River Street. For those who don't know, Evelyn Keyes would be where I would start. And she was the one, yes, who said, but I miss him now. He would protect me.
James.
Thank you so much thanks so much. It's such a pleasure to have you share your encyclopedic knowledge of noir. It's, what a privilege. Just a quick observation as a prompt for perhaps a question or a comment. I was struck by when we're talking about Jews and film noir. Of course, Jews in every Hollywood movie, because it's all Jews running the studios. It's all Jews, 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 Jews. But what was interesting was, but here in film noir, there's something is being made visible, something surfacing about this topic and Jewishness. And I was struck by almost every clip that you showed that visibility or surfacing was also very queer or queer adjacent. There's something like literally like every clip, maybe not.
When you say queer, are we talking?
Well, there's Balin, there's Gilda and Balin, there's John Garfield and his mom, there's Peter Lorre, who's clearly kind of gender ambiguous, right? I mean, very fluid in his presentation in Stranger on the Third Floor. So it was really interesting that tracked so much. And I'm wondering if you've thought at all about that, like just the adjacency or the.
Yes. I mean, noir probably has the most interesting take and possibilities for a variety of gender positions and attitudes and orientations. We have to remember that Hollywood did not get First Amendment protection until 1952. That's a long time. That's more than 10 years, for example, of film noir. The reason Hollywood did get First Amendment protection then was that television had replaced it as the family medium. Television was attracting more. It was in the home. So it became the natural site of censorship. But what I would say is that until 1952, and of course, Wild Advantage was not taken all at once in terms of mainstream Hollywood production, but until 1952 and this court ruling, noir was what Hollywood had instead of the First Amendment. By which I mean that it provided the perfect arena to explore the ambiguities, the secondary meanings, the subtle interactions that define and redirect gender sexual relations, love relations. In an interesting way, Noir knew how to use censorship. It was brilliant at using censorship, at skirting the boundaries and getting away with amazing things. So that's part of the exhilaration, is that sense of they're doing everything that can be done with what they've got.
Sure.
It's on. Okay, thank you. This was really fascinating. I wanted to ask you something that's been on my mind ever since I saw the first Blade Runner movie, which was being called
The first what movie?
Blade Runner.
Oh, Blade Runner, sorry.
Blade Runner.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, am I too close or too far?
No.
So the question has to do with, in my mind, when I think of noir, I think of black and white, as we did for many, many years. But then suddenly, and I think you referred to neo-noir, is that so?
Yes.
Is that
Yes, and
how can we have a noir movie that is not black and white? I guess is my
yes,
question.
no, it's a good question, and it's very hard to imagine noir without the traditions of black and white photography that preceded and coexisted with it. At the same time, it is worth remembering that there were classic noirs that were in Technicolor and that are unmistakably noirs. And the film I mentioned that you probably don't know, it's not that well known, would be the Gene Tierney movie I was describing, Leave Her to Heaven, which came from a best-selling novel. And that is beautifully, beautifully shot in extraordinary colors. And more, Hitchcock has been pulled into the noir canon. That would be a whole argument that I would make, would be that Nicholas Ray would be another. In a Lonely Place is pulled into the noir canon. For a long time, most of Hitchcock was not considered noir. But, you know, Hitchcock started working in color in the 50s. There are critics who claim Vertigo, which wasn't included in most noir encyclopedias until the last 10 or 15 years, consider Vertigo Hitchcock's greatest film and a film noir. And of course, it's also in not so flamingly gorgeous colors, but colors that are absolutely central to your experience of the film. It's a really interesting discussion that obviously we don't have time for now, because I think somehow I feel at home with black and white and noir. But there's no doubt that within that grouping, there are color noirs that couldn't leave it to heaven. I mean, there is killing, there is a femme fatale to end all femme fatales. It has all the kind of standard characteristics of a film noir, and as I say, it's in about as gorgeous Technicolor as you'll ever see.
Great. Well, I think we'll have to wrap up at this point, but please join me in thanking Anne.